I'm amazed after studying these teachings for a long time, 45, many years now, how the same things just look different each time. I've been working on a book, I am working on a book that I will be working on for a long time, about my whole life with Swami, or really about Swami's, what I witnessed of Swami's life year by year, sort of more or less the story of building Ananda, just what he was doing to make it happen, to carry the work out to the world. And so I'm reviewing, from the beginning, 1969 when I first met him, I'm up to 1984. It's slow going. I've been working on it for a long time. But what it's causing me to do is to go through incidents, and I have a fairly vivid memory, but not photographic by any means, and to read notes that I have and letters that he wrote, all kinds of things, all of which, of course, at one point or another I've read, and in fact, over the course of organizing the notes and so on, I've read repeatedly in the last decade. But nonetheless, trying to put them into some kind of cohesive whole story, just seeing everything that happened in 1982 or 1978 and seeing how one thing led to another and how it fit together, and then what Swami wrote at the end of the year or in the middle. I never knew anything about it before. The way the pieces go together, it's just startling to me. I could swear, except that I have these pieces of paper in the file and they have my fingerprints all over them, some of them, that I never saw them before. Because I wasn't capable of seeing what the pattern was, what his intention was. I could read his words, but I couldn't feel the consciousness behind it. And having that experience has just made more vivid to my mind what Swamiji is referring to in the reading today, about this idea we have that we are somehow an independent force, that this little space in which we live and all of our little thoughts run through it, that somehow, because we also in this particular age are able to hide our thoughts from other people, or let me phrase it differently, we think we hide our thoughts from other people, it gives us also this illusion of privacy. Somebody, I believe it was Purushottam actually, who wrote it in his book about the yugas. The yugas are the higher and lower ages of consciousness on this planet, a very interesting book which is in our boutique. He talked about in this age where we converse through words, either written or spoken, it's possible to lie. And depending how sensitive the person is that you're communicating with and how skillful you are at lying, you can get away with it. The world is full these days of stories of con artists who take advantage, and men who marry 3 or 4 women and take all their money, all these different things. And everybody says he was such a nice guy. Because if you can mask yourself enough, people can't see you. Purushottam is writing as the yugas advance, this age is the age of energy. It's Dwapara Yuga that we're in. The next age, Treta Yuga, which is hundreds of years from now, so don't think you can just hang out till we get there, is the age of mental power. And at that point, we begin to communicate telepathically. See, now we're using energy to facilitate communication. We email, nobody faxes anymore, but we used to fax. You email, you use the telephone, you use all of those little apps where you can all just look at each other like this and talk to each other, even no matter where you are. Oh, you have a question for someone in India, I'll just call them. And you just talk to them just like that. But we're still using words and the power of energy to unite ourselves. So at the other end of a telephone line, if you don't have a picture of that person, a lot can be going on that you won't know. In the age of mental telepathy, you won't be able to hide anymore. And fortunately, moral consciousness also rises, and so we won't want to hide anymore, or not as intensely as we do now. But one of these movements on the spiritual path of ever-expanding awareness is the understanding of our actual inner relationship with the world around us, and the gradual relaxing of this tight individuality that we're protecting all the time as we come into a more and more greater sense of connectedness and gradually of trust of a reality greater than ourselves. Well, many of us just spent this last week at Ananda Village. Many of us are still there because we have this annual week of spiritual renewal, which is quite an experience. It's been going on now since 1970, I believe. And it's a real gathering of the family from many places. The family is so big now, not everybody comes or can come. But I've been there since 71, often standing on the platform speaking to the group, which has gotten larger and larger, and was there this week just looking at about 300 people or so. And this, what I would say, a gradually developed sense of trust in that whole reality. I remember when I first moved to Ananda Village, which was the only Ananda there was at that time, a community up in the mountains. And it was the summer of 1971 when I started, and my own personal life immediately went into a rather tumultuous phase, which everybody's life does periodically, and mine does periodically. And it went tumultuous on me, and I was new, and I was naturally wanting to be well thought of, and more than that, prior to the time that I moved to Ananda, I really didn't belong anywhere. I had a very nice birth family in every way, but I knew that my birth family wasn't my destiny. But I didn't know what my destiny was. You're just standing there with this great sense of destiny, but nobody is responding. You're just kind of all by yourself out there with your destiny, and it's a lonely place. For me, it didn't last long enough for it to become agonizing, because I was young when I found my destiny, so to speak. But then there I was, accustomed to being quite solitary and quite protected, inwardly, self-protective. And two things happened simultaneously. One was that I realized that I had a great deal of intuition, and I could sense a lot of what was going on around me among people, whether they told me or not. And then with a chilling sense, I realized that probably everybody else could see into me in the same way. And it was actually, there's moments on the spiritual path that seem trivial in themselves, but you look back and you realize that these are real watershed moments, crossroads, where you take one path or another. And I stood there and I realized, and I put it in terms of the spiritual family that I had become a part of, but I realized I was really talking about myself and God, which is, if I walk this path, I'm going to be exposed. I'm going to be seen. And it was terrifying. But I realized, what could I do? I could just close back up and walk back, or I could go forward and just assume that whatever was inside of me, everybody was going to see. And I remember exactly where I was standing, and I just decided, well, I just have to. And I went on like that. And I've never regretted it. I've certainly been embarrassed a lot, mortified. Whether it's a bigger word than mortified. Humiliated is a good one. Humiliated is a very good one. All of those things have happened to me. Fortunately, we have Swami Kriyananda, whose life was extraordinary spiritually and also extremely interesting on the human level, because so many things happened to him. At a certain point, he decided that it was important, for the sake of Ananda, that he needed to model the life of a householder, even though Yogananda had made him a monk at the age of 22. But he saw that Ananda was supposed to develop as a householder community, and there just weren't any. And the ones that there were sort of embarrassed to be householders, and Swami put it, embarrassed to be married and ashamed to have children. And it just wasn't going the way it needed to go. And he felt that he's the one who'd set the tone for everything that ever happened there. And he was actually literally praying to Master and said, it's always been up to me. How are we going to deal with this one? And he felt Master inwardly say to him, well, you could get married. And Master, Swami responded, I'm a monk, like that. And Master said, well, you don't have to stay that way. So Swami opened himself to this, and shortly after he met a woman, he went to Hawaii on a holiday, and he met a woman in Hawaii and had this extraordinary spiritual connection with her, which to this day he can't really explain. But he said it was just, he'd never had a connection with someone that was so deeply inward that it just wasn't even related to the outward form of it. And in fact, he said later, it was so powerfully inward that it never left him. That when she left, which was very shortly afterwards, the feeling of expansive completeness that he had felt from her presence, he said, remained with him. It wasn't related to her in a strange way. He can't explain any more than that, and I can't either. But she arrived, she came to the community, everybody, there was a kerfuffle, a major kerfuffle, because we had him where he was supposed to be. And there was this whole sense of how dare he step out of our concept of who he was. His response was kind of like just a smile, like, really? What? I never did. You never owned me. What were you thinking? And a whole lot of readjustment had to take place. But it all took place. It was all just settled. We were all going along in this new reality. And then the woman left. 8 months after she arrived. Bingo, gone. Never came back. And she left before the announcement came out in the national magazines that Swami Kriyananda was now married, especially at that time Yoga Journal, which was was the biggest magazine, because it was all print media, like a 3-month lead time. So the announcement was in, the photograph, the whole story, the explanation, everything. By the time it was published, it was over. Swami had a bit of a crisis. The crisis was, I always trust my guidance, did I misinterpret my guru? Interesting. And that was a big crisis for him. And he withdrew, really completely withdrew for a few weeks. But then he finally came out and he said, but look, he said, all the transformation that I felt Ananda needed has happened. He said, I naturally assumed that the relationship would last longer, but it didn't. But the purpose of the guidance was fulfilled. And then he was just perfectly cheerful. But then it comes out in the national magazine, and congratulations start pouring in. And he sat just quietly in the living room, and he said, this is an embarrassing situation. He said, but I choose not to be embarrassed. And that was just it. Like, yes, but we are a part of all that is. We're all related to each other. These things happen. Subsequently, he met a woman in Italy who he actually did marry, and much wonderful came from it. And at the end of 12 years, he reassumed his sannyas vows, and that was that. And that was just sort of this little period of time. But the experience now, to come back to where I want to be, we are living interconnected to a greater reality. I think I've shared this with you, but I've thought about this many, many times. There's so many different ways to express the spiritual path. There's so many different reasons why people come into these four walls. Some of you come often. Some of you may be here for the first time. But it always comes down to a sense that there's something more going on, and I need to understand what that is. My little tiny world in which I just move by myself in it, even if I've collected a few beings who move with me, there's still this, it's just me. I get to do what I want. I make my little plans. I have my job. I have my savings. I have my this. And I just move all by myself. I have my ideas. And then something cracks that. Maybe it's a transcendental experience. Maybe it's sorrow or grief, on such a colossal scale that you cannot carry it. And so something cracks, and you suddenly sense yourself part of something greater. And there's a certain karmic point in our reincarnational cycle, and no one can push you toward that a minute before you want to take it. But there's a certain point in our reincarnational cycle where it occurs to us that there's something more, and I must find out what that is. Then we begin to discover that we were never this little isolated entity. We were always being influenced. I remember just as a teenager, before you get these things on a sophisticated level, I was just 14 and 15 years old trying to find my way. I didn't know the word bohemian at that time. I learned it later. The word beatnik came in just around that time, and that was a helpful word. All I could feel was the word misfit, was the one that came to me. I could never figure out what they were doing. And I certainly couldn't figure out why they were doing it. It just was all weird to me. And it manifested in girl-type ways. I became conscious. I didn't know about thrift stores and secondhand stores. If I had, it would have changed it slightly. I became extremely annoyed that you had to dress like everybody else because you couldn't buy anything except what everyone else was wearing. When I was 16 years old, in our local town, they had at the very classy department store. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was like a Nordstrom's kind of store. They had this thing where they hired high school kids, and they called you young careerists, and you got to wear this little uniform, but you were just a clerk in the store, and I have a really good mouth. So I talked my way into it, and I ended up one of these people, and because I looked like a pretty promising young careerist, they gave me the plum assignment, which was the teenage girls' clothing department, where there was all this poorly made, ugly stuff that I was supposed to sell. I was supposed to dupe my peers into buying. I got a very bad reputation in the store, so they moved me over to sheets and towels, where I did great, because people really need sheets and towels. It was a terrific experience. But it was just this feeling like, who is telling us that this is who we're supposed to be? That's what was annoying me so much. That just somebody was making these decisions, and then like sheep, everybody was just running after it. And it was just, it infuriated me, even though I had no alternative to it. I remember an older woman who was a bohemian. She kind of put her arm around me and patted me on her shoulder, and she was dressed like a gypsy. We were talking about clothes, actually. She was dressed like a gypsy in, 1964? It was not common. Don't worry, honey, you'll figure it out, kind of like that. You'll find your way. Of course, I found my way completely, thank you, God. But I was aware of the fact that there were just these forces, and they were pushing everybody, and nobody seemed to mind. In fact, they seemed to get excited when, some new idiotic fad would come through and just push everybody in some direction. When I got to be a devotee, I realized, wow, there's a whole philosophy about this. There's a whole philosophy about we are part of a greater reality, and that greater reality has a light and a dark dimension. And dark, right now, on this planet, is very dark. We have some really, really dark going on. I mean, when I was a teenager, dark was just ridiculous fashions. But now we have real dark. We did then too, I just wasn't listening. But we are part of a greater reality, and that greater reality exists on a spectrum. The good news is, ultimately, there is only light and distance from light. If you get far enough away from light, you may not be aware of the light. But the good news is you are never actually separated from the light. You can just get so far away from it that you don't feel it or see it anymore. But all you have to do is move closer to it, and it has never left you. But what we need to understand is we are part of a greater reality, but we are always being influenced. And what we think of so proudly as our own ideas are just the radio waves that are coming through, and we decide what we're going to tune into. When a friend of mine, when her husband died unexpectedly, she was is a very powerful devotee, and she understood life and death and karma and reincarnation and all of those things. So it didn't have, it wasn't tragic. It was sad because she loved him. She wasn't ready to say goodbye. But it wasn't tragic. He was just done. He'd gone somewhere. I find that so interesting. I have such a hard time figuring that out. I'm sure everybody does. Well, I presume everybody does. I mean, I'm here, but I haven't always been here. I haven't always been Asha. I was someone else. I mean, I had another name. I've always been myself, but I've had lots of little cycles. I was in the astral world, and there was a whole reality there, and then somehow or another, sperm and ovum united, and there I went, entered my mother's womb. Yogananda says it so interestingly. Birth on earth is a funeral in the astral world. A funeral on earth is a birthday party in the astral world. So, and when people die or go into near-death experiences and come back, they meet all these folk that they know and that they like and must have been missing them for a long time. Or you reincarnate and you're with people that you might not have incarnated with for a while, and you're so happy to see them again. You're always somewhere. We never lose our consciousness. You're just not always in the same place with the same people, or not always aware of it. So I think of my friend Tushti, who died in, whenever it was, March. And when she stopped breathing, she was no longer with us. And even in this moment, and maybe you can hear me, even in this moment, she's somewhere. But where is she? What is she doing? What is she tuning into? It's so fascinating. We're always conscious. But what we are conscious of, and even more importantly, what we allow to flow through us. So I was speaking of my friend whose husband died. It wasn't tragic. And people would say to her, "I'm so sorry you lost your husband." And she would say, "I didn't lose him. It wasn't like I left him on the counter at the grocery store and forgot to take him home." She said, "I know just where he is. He's just not here." But she said so seriously, she said, always lurking in the background, especially in those first weeks and months, she said, is this almost irresistible temptation to be sad. And it was so sweet. And I'm sure many times she gave in to that temptation. An almost irresistible temptation to be sad. You see, because always hovering around us is a force that actually has power, that's saying to us, the light is really too bright here. It's too much responsibility to be in the light. It's tiresome to always trying to be in the light. Why are you trying so hard? Why are you working so hard? You poor thing, just come over here. And yes, those people have been quite nasty to you, and you really ought to give them some of their own medicine back. Don't you think so? And so then it just goes and goes. And, we're not likely to do some of the horrible things we see being done. But it's all just the same spectrum. Those poor souls who are now doing things that are literally unimaginable and so horrifying to us that we don't even want to take our minds there. There's an almost irresistible, sometimes not resistible temptation to try to go so far away from the light that somehow I'll get something that I want. And what we're constantly doing is we are resisting, we are giving in, we are rising, we are falling, and in the process we are learning from our own experience, because unfortunately we are so hard-headed. There was just today I was watching there's this beautiful series of videos called Ask Me About Truth that was recorded at the very end of Swami's life with Dharmadas and Nirmalan himself. Very funky sort of recording. They're sitting in two chairs like this, and Swami's sitting in his chair, but they're just talking back and forth. And Dharmadas and Nirmala pretend to be a lot more ignorant than they actually are, just for the sake of asking questions. But it's just so quintessential Swami Kriyananda. It's fantastic. But just in the conversation, they were talking about the meaning of life, and Nirmala quoted that line. So if we look at the heavens and see a scrawl instead of a script, that's a poetic line from somebody. And Swami just chimes in from his side. She said, when we do that, Swami just said, because we're stupid. Just like that. And then the three of them just laughed with this just beautiful freedom of just, that's the story, isn't it? We just go forward, we try. Turns out that we were listening to the wrong voice. We just fall to the ground in a wreck. And as someone said once in a piece of advice, we get so discouraged, we just lie down and hope to die. And she said rather like this way, not so easy, is it? You lie down and hope to die, and after a while you get hungry. Time and time again. And so I'm just going to say the word Satan because that's what our reading is about today. But that's what it is, that almost irresistible temptation to move away from the light instead of toward it. It's an active conscious force. Call it yourself, call it Satan, call it the great green pumpkin if you want to. It doesn't really make any difference what you call it. We live it. And we must resist it. For a very simple reason. You won't go to hell. You'll just put yourself in hell. You won't be in hell. You won't be condemned to hell. You'll just willingly walk in, which is far worse. And then recognize, I am part of a greater reality. And therefore, I can choose which part of it I want to live in. It's very simple to say, more challenging to do, but very simple to say, this is an almost irresistible temptation. But with the grace of God, I will resist, and I will live in the light. And who will benefit first? Me. Which experience do we want? The light or the dark? It's in our hands. And with the grace of God, we will choose correctly. God bless you.